If the year 1763 was a slow-motion car crash for the British Empire, then December was the moment that the vehicle finally slammed into the wall and burst into flames. For 11 months, the American colonies had endured a relentless pummeling. They had survived the confusing peace negotiations of winter, the terrifying Indian uprisings of spring, the military disasters of summer, and the economic depression of autumn. Through it all, the social fabric of the colonies had held together barely. The colonists had directed their rage outward, at the French, at the Indians, at the distant enemies of the king. In December 1763, the rage turned inward. This month is defined by a single horrific event that signaled the end of colonial unity and the beginning of the racial and political violence that would define the American frontier for the next century. I'm talking about the Conestoga Massacre. On a snowy December morning, a group of frontiersmen known as the Paxton Boys rode into a peaceful village of Christianized Native Americans and slaughtered them. When the survivors were taken into protective custody by the government, the mob broke into the jail and finished the job. This was not a battle, it was a pogrom. And it wasn't just about killing Indians. It was a violent political statement, a rebellion of the poor, rural, Scots-Irish frontier against the wealthy, urban Quaker elite in Philadelphia. It was a civil war in miniature. December 1763 also saw the arrival of the Proclamation of 1763 in the colonial press, confirming to the land-hungry settlers that their king had betrayed them. It saw General Thomas Gage take command of the British forces, bringing a new era of military occupation. And it saw Patrick Henry rise in a Virginia courtroom to challenge the king's authority in the Parsons cause, firing the first rhetorical shot of the Revolution. December 1763 was a bloody, chaotic finale to the most decisive year in colonial history. First, let's look at the Conestoga Massacre, perpetrated by the Paxton Boys. Here was the context. By December, the Pennsylvania frontier was a living hell. The refugees in Paxton and Donegal townships near modern Harrisburg were freezing, starving, and terrified. So what was the perception? Well, they believed the Quaker-dominated assembly in Philadelphia cared more about the Indians than about white Christians. They pointed to the fact that the assembly sent blankets to Moravian Indians, which were converts, while refusing to pay for a frontier militia. And what was the rumor? Well, in the fevered atmosphere of the taverns, a conspiracy theory took root. The peaceful Conestoga Indians living on a manor protected by the Penn family were actually spies. They were harboring strange Indians who committed the raids. By the way, there was no evidence for this. So the first massacre occurred on December 14th, 1763. On the morning of Wednesday, December 14th, about 50 armed men from Paxton rode through the snow to Conestoga Indian Town near Lancaster. Here was the attack. Most of the Conestoga were out selling brooms or working. Only 6 people were home, 3 men, 2 women, and a young boy. So what was the slaughter? Well, the Paxton Boys burned the cabins and murdered the 6 inhabitants. They scalped them and mutilated the bodies. And what was the reaction? Well, the sheriff of Lancaster, hearing the news, rode out and collected the 14 surviving Conestogas who had been away during the attack. He placed them in the Lancaster workhouse, which basically means the jail, for their own protection. He assumed the mob would respect the law. But this led to the second massacre on December 27th, 1763. The protection of the government was an illusion. The Paxton Boys, emboldened by the lack of consequences, reassembled. On December 27th, they rode into Lancaster. They broke down the doors of the workhouse. The 14 Conestoga Indians, men, women, and children, fell to their knees and prayed. But here's how it ended. The mob slaughtered them all with hatchets and knives. There were no survivors. So what was the significance of this? Well, this event shocked the Atlantic world. Benjamin Franklin wrote a blistering pamphlet called A Narrative of the Late Massacres, calling the Paxton Boys Christian white savages. But to the frontier population, the Paxton Boys were heroes. They had done what the government refused to do. They cleansed the land. This then culminated in a march. As December ended, the Paxton Boys did not disperse. They began to march toward Philadelphia. Their goal was to kill the Moravian Indians who had been evacuated to the city for their own safety, and perhaps to overthrow the Quaker government itself. December 1763 ended with the capital of Pennsylvania preparing for a civil war against its own citizens. There was also a voice of treason that's been called the Parson's Cause. While Pennsylvania bled, Virginia argued. December 1763 marked the rise of Patrick Henry, the man who would eventually say, "Give me liberty or give me death." The issue was the Two-Penny Act. Let's look at the background. In Virginia, Anglican ministers were paid in tobacco, 16,000 pounds per year. When a drought caused tobacco prices to spike, the Virginia Assembly passed the Two-Penny Act, allowing them to pay ministers in cash at a fixed, low rate of 2 pennies per pound, rather than the inflated market value of tobacco. But then there was the veto. The ministers complained to the king. The king vetoed the Virginia law. The ministers then sued for their back pay. So, on December 1st, 1763, there was a trial. In Hanover County Courthouse, a young, unknown lawyer named Patrick Henry defended the parish vestry against the Reverend James Morey. What was the argument? Henry did not argue the law. The law was clearly on the minister's side. The king had vetoed the act. He argued ideology, which then morphed into his speech. See, Henry declared that a king who vetoes a law passed by a locally elected assembly that is salutary to the people degenerates into a tyrant and forfeits the obedience of his subjects. So what was the verdict? Well, the jury was mesmerized. They found for the minister, as the law required, but awarded him 1 penny in damages. So what did that mean? Well, this was treason. In a tiny courtroom in December 1763, Patrick Henry articulated the core argument of the revolution: local representation trumps royal authority. There was also the official arrival of the proclamation, which was also seen largely as a betrayal. See, the news broke that King George III had signed the Proclamation of 1763 in October. It took until December for the full text to be published in colonial newspapers like the Pennsylvania Gazette and the New York Mercury. Here was the fine print. As the colonists read the text in December, the reality sank in. What was the line? Well, the text was explicit. No settlement beyond the heads of rivers flowing into the Atlantic. This, of course, inferred an eviction. The phrase "forthwith to remove themselves" terrified the thousands of squatters already living in the Greenbrier and Monongahela valleys. And of course, there were also speculators. For men like George Washington, this was a business disaster. The Mississippi Land Company and the Ohio Company were technically defunct. In December, Washington began plotting how to circumvent the law, instructing his surveyors to hunt out and mark land secretly. This marks the moment that the colonial elite began to view the British law as an obstacle to be bypassed, rather than a rule to be obeyed. There was also a changing of the guard taking place. General Jeffrey Amherst, the man whose arrogance and economy measures had sparked Pontiac's war, finally left in December. He sailed for England on the Weasel, leaving behind a continent in flames. He was widely reviled by the colonists, who blamed him for the lack of protection. That, of course, created the entry of Gage. His replacement was General Thomas Gage, who assumed command in New York in mid-December. What was his style? Well, Gage was more cautious, more diplomatic, and married to an American woman, Margaret Kemble of New Jersey. Gage inherited a mess. He was the one who had to enforce the proclamation. He was the one who had to decide how to pay for the troops. And what was the significance? Gage would be the commander-in-chief for the next 12 years. He would be the man who sent the troops to Lexington and Concord in 1775. His tenure began here, in the wreckage of December 1763, with a mandate to bring order to the unruly colonies. December also saw a bottoming out of the Depression. This was definitely a hard winter for returns. December 1763 saw the return of severe weather, though not as brutal as the Little Ice Age of the previous year. So what was the impact? Well, the cold compounded the misery of the Depression. In Boston, the overseers of the poor reported record numbers of applicants for firewood and bread. Of course, there were also the bankruptcies. The wave of business failures continued. The shutting down of the Niagara Portage due to the Devil's Hole Massacre in September meant that the annual fur fleet didn't arrive in New York. The economy was stagnant, and there were tax rumors. By December, rumors of Grenville's new tax plan, the Sugar Act, were hardening into fact. So what was the merchants' reaction? In Boston, merchants began to form committees of correspondence to petition Parliament. This was the infancy of organized political resistance. They weren't talking about independence. They were talking about survival. They argued that if they were taxed during a depression, they'd be ruined. So what was the texture of life in December of 1763? Well, first there was a religious Great Awakening still taking place. The atrocities of the Paxton Boys sparked a fierce religious debate in Pennsylvania. On one side, you had the pamphlet war. Philadelphia exploded in print. The Quakers published tracts condemning the Presbyterian murderers. The Presbyterians published tracts condemning the Quaker hypocrites. So what was the divide? This wasn't just theology. It was ethnic. The English Quakers, pacifist and urban, versus the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, militant and rural. December 1763 fractured the holy experiment of Pennsylvania. You also had the white captives. In the Ohio Valley, the Shawnee and Delaware began settling into their winter camps. They held hundreds of white captives taken during the summer raids. What was their experience? Well, December was the time of integration. The captives were given Indian clothes, had their hair plucked, and were adopted into families to replace the dead. For many, this was the beginning of a transformation where they would eventually refuse to return to white society, a phenomenon that baffled the colonists. As the sun set on December 31st, 1763, the British American colonies were unrecognizable from the place that they had been on January 1st. You see, in January, they were proud Britons, celebrating the defeat of France and looking forward to a golden age. But by December, they were a fractured, frightened, and angry people. They were legally barred from the West by proclamation. They were militarily occupied by a standing army. They were economically ruined by the Depression. They were internally divided by the Paxton Boys. And they were politically radicalizing by people like Patrick Henry. The year 1763 did not just end. It collapsed. It stripped away the illusions of the empire. It revealed that the interests of the mother country, order, revenue, control were fundamentally incompatible with the interests of the colonies, land, trade, autonomy. The American Revolution is often taught as a reaction to the Stamp Act of 1765, but the psychological revolution happened in 1763. This was the year that the trust died. When the Paxton Boys hacked the Conestoga Indians to death in Lancaster jail, they weren't just killing people. They were killing the idea of William Penn's peace. And when Patrick Henry called the king a tyrant in a Virginia courthouse, he was giving voice to a thought that had been silently growing in the minds of thousands. We're on our own. The road to 1776 began here in the blood and ink of December 1763.